Picture this: Keanu Reeves, cloaked in shadow and enigma, strides into a New York City night so mercilessly cold it could shatter souls and freeze time itself. A night poised to unravel a tale so astonishing it make even the skyscrapers lean in to eavesdrop. The air bites like a living beast, clawing through every layer of fabric with icy talons, while spectral steam erupts from the streets below, whispering secrets of a hidden underworld churning beneath the concrete. Above, the towering giants of glass and steel sway under a sky swollen with brooding clouds, daring the city to tremble under their gaze. Amid this frozen chaos, people dart past like ghosts, eyes locked ahead, as if a single glance could unravel their defenses. Until Keanu, a quiet titan among them, steps into the storm, igniting a mystery that promises to thaw the iciest hearts and leave you questioning. What could one man do to turn this frigid night into a legend? In the heart of this chaos, Keanu Reeves seemed almost invisible despite his fame, an odd phenomenon that occurred whenever he slipped into simple attire and gently ducked his head beneath a well-worn beanie. From a short distance, he could have been mistaken for any other city wanderer, perhaps just another soul trying to make sense of the restless metropolis. Yet there was a subtle magnetism about him, an inexplicable glow that radiated from the quiet confidence in his posture and the thoughtful calm behind his gaze. Where others might have hustled with elbows out, forging a path through the crowd with impatience, Keanu moved gently, a single figure at peace in the churning sea of humanity. On that frigid evening, he ventured beyond the bright and polished downtown restaurants into a cozier, less conspicuous diner on the Lower East Side. There, he finished a modest supper of soup and warm bread. He cherished these small, unassuming spots where the staff had grown accustomed to the fleeting presence of celebrities, or simply did not care who he was. After settling his bill, he lingered for a brief moment, long enough to appreciate the swirl of coffee-scented air and the hushed lull that enveloped the place as the night deepened. Outside, neon lights flashed in dancing pinks and greens, illuminating wet pavement that reflected the shifting glow like an urban kaleidoscope. Once back on the streets, he stepped into a wind so biting it felt like the city itself intended to challenge him. Yet, the breeze also carried a quiet note of anticipation. The unpredictability of the night held a certain thrill, as if anything could happen once a person surrendered to the unknown. Keanu tucked his gloved hands into his coat pockets, his breath crystallizing in front of him. He walked slowly with no obvious urgency, allowing Manhattan's electric tempo to guide him. Eventually, a soft murmur from a darkened alleyway took hold of his attention. At first, it was just a faint stirring in the shadows, easy to dismiss if one were determined to remain oblivious. The silhouette of a man materialized under a dim, flickering street lamp. This man, this isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. Draped in a coat that looked as if it had survived a war, sat on a sagging piece of cardboard, knees drawn to his chest to conserve warmth. His posture bore the weariness of someone who had learned the meaning of despair through countless brutal days and nights. Keanu approached carefully, every step guided by genuine concern. He surveyed the battered state of this stranger, chapped hands extending from tattered sleeves, the deeply etched creases that lined his face, the subtle trembling that suggested the cold had penetrated beyond muscle and bone. Although people all around remained in constant motion, the energy of the city seemed to pause for an instant in that narrow space, as though the surrounding buildings had decided to listen in. A single question appeared to hover over them. Would anyone offer help, or would this be just another evening where empathy surrendered to disregard? Keanu, compelled by his quiet resolve, stepped nearer. He bent slightly at the waist, hands still lodged in his pockets to ward off the chill, and looked closely at the man. Although this moment was silent, it bristled with the unspoken desire for understanding, an invisible plea that asked if someone might care enough to give more than a passing glance. In the hush of that chance meeting, Keanu's mind flickered with recollections of the times he had grappled with grief and loss. He remembered how easily one could feel discarded by a world that seemed perpetually preoccupied with its own affairs. Compassion had often found a way into his life in unexpected forms, and if there was any universal truth he had discovered, it was that kindness frequently started with a single, simple act. So he made a deliberate choice that night, to extend warmth and presence to someone who, until that moment, had appeared invisible to the city swirling around them. He motioned for the man to join him in the pursuit of comfort, somewhere less exposed, somewhere where the taste of hot coffee might restore the spirit. Together, they walked a few blocks to a small, rustic café that clung to an old-world charm. Once inside, the hush of the dimly lit interior offered a brief sanctuary from the roar of traffic outside. The luminous glow of pendant lamps revealed shelves lined with pastries and bagels, their comforting scents drifting through the air. Keanu found them a small table by a frosted window, the glass blurred by the cold outside. People came and went, some casting curious glances as they realized the figure in the corner resembled the famous actor whose name they'd heard countless times. Yet the city had its own code of nonchalance. On the rare occasions a person did recognize him, they preferred to leave him to his moment, or perhaps they feared their illusions would crumble if they intruded. For many, crossing the boundary between the external show of celebrity and the vulnerable intimacy of genuine conversation was a step they dared not take. He encouraged the man to warm his hands around a cup of coffee and to let steam fill his lungs with comfort, as if inhaling the promise of a new beginning. The man's eyes betrayed an uneasy blend of surprise and gratitude that no words could fully convey. With unwavering calm, Keanu directed his focus on the man's experiences, where he had come from, how life had taken the shape it did, and which fragments of hope he might still harbor. By simply asking and truly listening, Keanu extended the kind of acknowledgement so often missing in a city known for cultivating countless lonely souls. Time seemed suspended in that warm enclave. The man, cautious but emboldened by the sincerity he perceived, gradually revealed fragments of his story, phases of fleeting normalcy, a hard-hitting job loss, escalating bills that led to an eviction, then a sudden plunge into the stark reality of homelessness. As he confessed the harrowing truth of how life's unpredictability could dismantle even the strongest resolve, he displayed an odd mixture of relief and lingering shame. Keanu empathized deeply, recognizing in those raw confessions the universal vulnerability that any person, regardless of status or wealth, could face. He felt it vital to remind the man, through gentle, measured observations and reflections, that there remained undiscovered avenues for reclamation. Sometimes, all it took was one genuine act of recognition to ignite a dormant spark of self-worth. From that moment forward, a subtle transformation began. The man, whose name was Michael, seemed to relax in the presence of someone who saw him as more than just a statistic. Every comforting sip of coffee dissolved a little more of Michael's hardened cynicism. In that quiet corner, with the city's constant thrumming muffled by the cafe walls, Michael even allowed himself to acknowledge the faint flicker of possibility. Hours passed like minutes. Keanu, resolute in his approach, remained unwavering in his determination to do more than just treat Michael to a meal. He believed that sustained change took shape through consistent effort. While a single moment of kindness could kindle hope, it was the string of supportive steps that followed which transformed a fleeting encounter into something far more enduring. Later that night, when they left the cafe, the air still bit fiercely, but Michael noticed that his outlook felt ever so slightly altered. The neon signs of New York flared overhead, and the swirl of steam around the manhole covers appeared less ominous. Keanu guided him to a modest hotel whose aging facade was evidence of many lived-in stories over the decades. It was not the type of place that starred in travel magazines or boasted cutting-edge amenities, but it offered security and warmth, two luxuries that had eluded Michael for too long. No direct exchange of words was needed to convey Michael's gratitude as Keanu covered the cost of a simple room. Within those walls, Free from the scrutiny of a judging crowd, Michael experienced his first full night of rest in what felt like an eternity. A locked door might appear trivial to those who never lacked security, but for Michael, it symbolized a potential turning point. In the morning, as pale sunlight pressed through the gaps in the curtains, Michael awoke in a bed that practically felt unfamiliar, so soft compared to the unforgiving pavement he had grown accustomed to. There was a sense of disorientation at first, a momentary disbelief that the frigid darkness outside had not simply been replaced with another precarious day with nowhere to call home. But reality soon anchored him. The four walls around him were real, the bed was real, and the promise of a small meal was real. Keanu visited again, inviting Michael to share a simple breakfast. The new day carried a faint undercurrent of optimism. While the city roared as usual beyond the hotel lobby, the two of them stood at the threshold of a potential transformation. Over a quiet morning meal, Keanu hinted that a friend of his owned a little hardware store in need of an extra set of hands, nothing flashy or glamorous, but honest work that might offer Michael a foothold back into everyday life. Once more, Michael felt a mix of wary skepticism and a stirring sense of hope. Opportunities this genuine rarely came around without some hidden catch, yet Keanu's demeanor was disarmingly earnest. By midday, Michael found himself stepping inside a cluttered hardware shop. Dust motes floated through narrow beams of light that slanted in through the windows. Stacks of paint cans lined one wall, while metal tools of varying shapes and sizes hung from pegboards on another. The store's owner, a straight-talking individual who seemed unimpressed by big names or illusions of grandeur, evaluated Michael with a keen eye. Despite his initial gruffness, he recognized that Michael was someone willing to start fresh. The owner handed Michael a modest list of duties: stock the shelves, guide confused customers, learn the basics of the trade, and told him to start bright and early the next day. The weight of that moment settled over Michael in a way that was almost dizzying. Pride and anxiety collided in his thoughts. It had been so long since he had felt the stability of a schedule, the routine of a job, and the straightforward dignity of earning his keep. Yet there he was, on the cusp of something that might piece together the tattered fragments of his life. Keanu continued to linger in the background, occasionally offering a supportive nod, but refraining from overshadowing Michael's chance to claim this victory on his own. The actor believed that real change was seldom about grand gestures. Rather, it was the unbroken thread of smaller moments, each building upon the last, that rewrote the trajectory of a life. Over the course of that first day and into the evening, Michael experienced a complex swirl of feelings: gratitude, uncertainty, fear, and a spark of excitement so long dormant he had nearly forgotten what it felt like. When nighttime fell again, both men navigated the lively sidewalks where bars and restaurants were just hitting their stride, passing clusters of revelers who laughed beneath the glow of neon. In the midst of those fleeting clusters of strangers, Michael felt a sense of grounding. The swirl of life no longer seemed so overwhelming. He and Keanu found a quiet corner where they could rest for a moment and reflect. In a city that seldom paused to reflect, it felt almost revolutionary for them to share a moment of reprieve from the relentless motion. Michael took mental stock of the surreal changes he had experienced in just a matter of days. A few nights prior, he had been consumed by the cold, unsure if he would wake the following morning. Now, he had a secure place to sleep and the prospect of work that, if he persevered, might allow him to climb out of the pit he had been stuck in for far too long. And at the center of it all was Keanu Reeves, whose unwavering presence seemed guided by a deep belief in humanity and the power of generosity. That week, Michael's life became a tapestry of cautious progress. Early mornings ushered him to the hardware store, where he would straighten messy shelves, sort screws and bolts, and help perplexed customers make sense of the labyrinth of items on display. He was no expert, but the store owner recognized diligence when he saw it and extended sporadic tips on how to handle fussy patrons or locate seldom requested items. At the end of each day, Michael found that a new sort of tiredness claimed him, the kind born not from ceaseless worry or constant searching for a safe corner to rest, but from the simple honesty of physical work. All the while, Keanu remained an understated but steady guide. He offered occasional words of encouragement, though they were never direct instructions. Instead, he nudged Michael to explore life's possibilities, to consider that maybe he had more capabilities than the harsh spiral of his past would lead him to believe. Whenever Michael discovered a new sense of competence, like when he learned how to use a basic tool he had never heard of before, Keanu showed quiet pride, always careful to let Michael take ownership of each small triumph. By the close of that first week, Michael had earned his initial paycheck, a modest sum that perhaps would not excite others, but for him felt like a precious milestone. He stood at the counter of the hardware store, staring at the slip of paper in his hand, grappling with emotions too layered to neatly categorize. In that single paycheck lay the proof that he could re-enter society on his own terms, that he could once again define himself by something other than the cracks in the sidewalk where he used to sleep. As the days rolled into the second week, Michael began exploring the possibility of finding a more permanent place to stay. Keanu, true to form, remained available with ideas and supportive gestures, but withheld from making decisions on Michael's behalf. The actor believed deeply that personal autonomy was key to truly rebuilding, and so he insisted that Michael handle the details. If there was a room available in a shared apartment across town, Michael himself would need to reach out, set up the meeting, and negotiate the rent. Keanu provided moral support, not paternal guidance. Even so, moments of self-doubt clung to Michael like a persistent winter chill. Each step forward seemed to reawaken old fears. He remembered the day he lost his job, the avalanche of unpaid bills, and the day he was forced from his apartment. Those memories sometimes loomed larger than hope, warning him that good fortune could vanish in a blink. Yet each time despair flickered in his eyes, Keanu offered something intangible, a reminder that the future need not mirror the past, and that resilience, once tapped, could dismantle any narrative of inevitability. New York City itself formed the background to Michael's rebirth. Its ceaseless roar, the swirl of traffic, and the cosmopolitan mix of languages and faces took on new meaning. The once hostile sidewalks and shadowy alleyways, which had signified futility, now hosted glimpses of possibility. Passing strangers held a different significance. If kindness could come from a chance encounter with an internationally known actor, who could say what other surprises the city might hold? As the grip of winter tightened, Michael discovered layers of strength within himself. Each day he hoisted boxes, memorized item codes, and guided confused patrons to the correct aisles. When his shift ended, he spent spare hours researching small apartments or rooms for rent, carefully budgeting the limited funds at his disposal. It was not easy, but it was real. Keanu, for his part, rarely needed to utter grand or stirring phrases. Instead, he acted as a constant presence, exuding calm and sincerity. He made it clear that his intention was never to shape Michael's future from the outside. Rather, he served as a catalyst, offering hope that had to be ignited by Michael's own determination. On nights when Michael felt the weight of his past threatening to resurface, he'd occasionally glimpse Keanu's reassuring nod, an unspoken affirmation that he had the ability to weather any lingering storm. In quiet hours, perhaps while the hardware store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Michael found himself alone in an aisle, restocking a row of tools, he reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had transpired. The swirling edges of memory reminded him that less than a month earlier, he had struggled simply to survive. That was the day a stranger noticed him in a lonely alley and extended not just $1, but something infinitely more valuable: the respect that sees another human being as an equal rather than a burden. Gradually, stories about Keanu's real-life warmth and authenticity had spread across the internet, and through casual conversations. But to Michael, it was not rumor or speculation. It was the tangible lifeline that had lifted him from the brink. He marveled that a celebrated actor, someone who could have turned a blind eye or offered a quick fix before rushing to an extravagant engagement, chose instead to engage meaningfully with a person who had reached the darkest crevice of hardship. With each passing day, Michael grew more assured in his own agency. If the store owner was teaching him how to reorder merchandise and check deliveries, Michael would absorb this knowledge as if it were critical for his survival. He arrived earlier in the mornings, overcame any lingering discomfort about living in the cheap motel until he could afford better, and gradually refined the casual niceties of interacting with regular customers. Late one evening, after shutting off the hardware store's lights, he stepped outside and let the cold air fill his lungs. The city lights glittered in the distance, forming an infinite sprawl of stories waiting to be told. He recalled the intangible mixture of terror and hope he had felt when he first accepted Keanu's help. Now, the terror was gradually receding, replaced by a firmer sense that this was not some fleeting miracle. Every day he chose to show up, to do the work, and to confront the shadow of his past. He solidified his stand in this new chapter of his life. For Keanu's part, his plan was refreshingly modest: to be there, to see Michael through a period of transition, and to illuminate the idea that small steps consistently taken could revitalize an entire life. These steps involved no illusions of glamorous transformations. They leaned instead on slow, consistent effort, food, shelter, honest labor, a pay stub, and the restoration of personal dignity. Thus, Chapter 1 of this unfolding story centered on the quiet synergy between a compassionate stranger and a struggling individual who dared to accept that compassion. From a solitary moment in the cold alley to the everyday routine of a hardware store, from solitary exhaustion to a cautious reawakening of trust, Michael's journey demonstrated that transformations, even the profound ones, were rarely accompanied by dramatic fanfare. They were built on the resolute daily choice to keep going, and the self-discovery that perhaps one was never as powerless as once believed. Indeed, the world had not changed drastically in the span of a month. New York remained frantic and disinterested, with its glaring inequalities and relentless pace. Snow continued to threaten from the low clouds, and homeless individuals still dotted the city's hidden corners, many of them unseen and unheard. Nonetheless, in Michael's corner of the city, a slender ember of hope had been ignited, sustained by Keanu's uncommon generosity and Michael's newly fortified resolve. That ember was not just about having a bed to sleep in or a hot meal to eat. It symbolized the possibility of rejoining society, of no longer being written off by the endless crowd. With each sunrise, Michael felt the weight of illusion slipping away. The illusion that he was alone, the illusion that second chances were fairy tales, and the illusion that survival meant never again trusting another soul. What began as a single act of compassion had started to ripple outward, influencing how Michael saw himself and the world around him. If one evening's kindness could make such a difference, what else might be possible in the days, weeks, and months to come? Michael's lingering anxiety whispered caution, but it could not stifle the hum of cautious optimism he now carried in his chest. Inside the boundaries of this new chapter, Keanu Reeves continued to stand like a steady lighthouse, guiding Michael through the swirling tide of self-doubt. Yet he remained mindful never to overshadow the necessity of Michael's own perseverance. The star was a catalyst, not a savior, a bearer of kindness, not a puppeteer. As the first phase of this story drew to a close, Michael found himself gazing out the window of his motel room late at night, the lights of the city dancing off the partially frosted glass. He recognized that the real tests were still to come: finding a permanent living arrangement, holding on to employment, contending with emotional wounds that had been festering for years. None of that would vanish overnight. Yet, he had a direction now. The quiet surge of empowerment that allowed him to hold his head a bit higher each morning was no small gift. Most importantly, Michael had discovered that life's most remarkable turning points could materialize in the silent spaces of an ordinary night. A modest café, a battered coat, a single encounter amid an onslaught of passers-by. These were the humble building blocks of redemption. Every new morning, he prepared himself for the challenges and promises that come with forging a path out of homelessness, out of despair, and into a realm where he might regain a sense of control. In that singular spark of awareness, Chapter 1 reached its conclusion. Yet it was by no means the endpoint. Michael's rediscovery of hope would need further nurturing, further risk, and further leaps of faith. Keanu Reeves, the unassuming force who had entered the fray of Michael's life on that frigid night, would remain an essential figure in the narrative that was still unfolding. The city's heartbeat, relentless and unstoppable, set the tempo for the next act. In a world often fraught with cynicism, the story of how one small seed of empathy could flourish into a powerful transformation stood as an uplifting reminder that salvation, like misfortune, could greet anyone, anywhere, at any time. Morning arrived in a quiet flourish of pink and orange light washing over the skyline, each bar of color creeping across tall buildings as if to remind the city that even after the deepest darkness, daybreak was inevitable. With the approach of dawn, New York glimmered in its mosaic of early hustle, joggers conquering the sidewalks, shop owners raising metal grates, and the occasional hum of bread trucks making deliveries. Inside a small, modest motel room, Michael stirred from the last tendrils of sleep. He blinked up at a ceiling that felt foreign yet comforting, a modest overhead lamp, chipped paint near the corners, yet a profound sense of security that had been absent for so long. He rose, let the frayed edges of the carpet press gently into his bare feet, and thought back to the previous month. There had been moments, frightening ones, when each morning found him curled on a piece of cardboard, shivering beneath an unforgiving sky. Now, although the room was anything but luxurious, it offered privacy and warmth. By the window, an old curtain let in the day's early glow, and for a brief moment, Michael closed his eyes and let the stillness remind him that a new chapter was firmly underway. He dressed in his work clothes, an unremarkable pair of jeans and a plain shirt, but despite their simplicity, they felt to him like symbols of self-reliance. Folding the thin motel blanket with something akin to reverence, he recalled how he had once hoarded every item of clothing as though it might be snatched away without warning. Now, he had an employer who expected him each day, and this served as a steadfast anchor in his life. Downstairs, the motel lobby offered weekly percolating coffee and small packages of muffins. Michael thanked the clerk at the front desk, noticing that simply showing this kind of courtesy had grown natural for him. Every gesture, from a polite good morning to a subtle wave at a passerby, felt like a sign of reintegration into the world he once assumed had no place for him. Outside, the air still held a residual chill, but the kind that invigorated rather than threatened. As Michael stepped onto the concrete, he looked both ways along the street. He had begun walking to the hardware store most days, a brisk half-hour that gave him time to gather his thoughts or savor the simple wonder of existing in a city that, for all its rough edges, also teemed with unspoken possibility. With every step, he remembered how precarious his situation had been not long before, when he felt invisible to the ceaseless tide of pedestrians. The store had grown into something of a sanctuary, dusty corners and creaking shelves notwithstanding. It existed at the intersection of old traditions and new chants. Its aging walls had borne witness to countless repairs, renovations, and expansions over the years, yet they maintained their welcoming spirit for regulars and newcomers alike. Michael emerged from the morning light into the store's interior, where a faint scent of metal, sawdust, and paper receipts greeted him. He inhaled, feeling a small surge of confidence. Since his first day, he had learned to handle routine tasks with greater efficiency. He now took pride in his ability to direct customers to the correct aisles, restock materials in the proper order, and maintain a mental inventory of where items belonged. "Joe, you felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. Owner remained gruff in demeanor, but his earlier skepticism had softened into an unspoken trust. If a visitor inquired about the best type of drill bit for a project, Joe might let Michael guide them, monitoring from a distance to ensure all went smoothly. Though the workday itself was largely uneventful, it signified the calm reliability that Michael had craved for years. Each task, no matter how small, represented a mosaic piece of the future he was slowly piecing together. He appreciated that the store never felt too large or overwhelming. He could find his way through the aisles with a quiet confidence he had never possessed while living on the streets. Several days into this new routine, Keanu Reeves reappeared in Michael's life at the exact moment the latter needed fresh guidance. Keanu arrived at closing time, stepping into the hardware store amid a slow hush of the city settling for evening. His understated presence, from the way he slipped in almost unnoticed to the warmth he carried in his eyes, still seemed at odds with the fame that shadowed him whenever he stepped out in public. Though he wore a simple coat and a beanie, some customers recognized him, greeting him with discreet nods or starstruck smiles. Keanu politely acknowledged them before turning his full attention to Michael. The connection between them had deepened since that night in the alley, growing from the initial kindness into an unspoken camaraderie. Though Michael was reluctant to rely on someone else, he also respected how Keanu's presence seemed to keep him anchored. Keanu, on the other hand, balanced offering supportive gestures with giving Michael space. It was a dynamic that required mutual respect. Michael's acknowledgement of Keanu's quiet generosity, and Keanu's refusal to let Michael view himself merely as a recipient of help rather than a participant in his own betterment. Over the next few days, Keanu proposed a new plan, something to carry Michael beyond the transitional motel. While the small weekly rental room provided safety and comfort, it was time to consider something more stable. Keanu, who had crossed paths with countless people and heard numerous stories during his travels, knew that incremental progress often motivated the spirit, while stagnation could threaten a relapse into despair. He suggested that Michael begin looking for a permanent place, a modest apartment or a shared living situation that would allow Michael to plant roots. Though Michael hesitated, harboring old fears of deals gone wrong or betrayals in the final hour, he found reassurance in how Keanu refrained from pushing or dictating. Instead, Keanu simply reminded him that sustaining real change required a willingness to step into the unknown. Eventually, Michael agreed to consider a tiny studio near the edge of a gentrifying neighborhood, a place that was once overlooked but now welcomed those willing to adapt. This decision prompted a wave of new realizations. Michael recognized the importance of establishing a history of steady income, managing utility bills, and balancing basic expenses such as groceries against the cost of rent. The sudden complexity felt overwhelming at times, yet infinitely more hopeful than the struggles of his previous life. The idea of re-entering the rental market, signing a lease, paying a deposit, once felt completely out of reach. Now, after multiple paychecks, he carried the seeds of possibility in his bank account. Keanu, true to form, offered to introduce Michael to a supportive network of acquaintances. Among them was a landlord who, though strict and businesslike, maintained a policy of giving second chances to individuals who displayed responsibility and perseverance. It was not an outright favor, nor a relaxed condition, merely an opportunity for Michael to be considered on his own merits. The landlord agreed to meet at a nearby café one afternoon. Michael showed up early, inhaling deeply to steady his nerves, and settled into a corner seat to wait. Through the window, the city hustled in its midday routine. Buses rattled by, cabs honked at drivers who hesitated a second too long, and office workers bustled to claim quick lunches. When the landlord arrived, a composed woman dressed in a sharp overcoat, Michael introduced himself with polite confidence. While he was transparent about his past housing troubles, he explained that he was now employed and determined to move forward. Carefully, he presented his modest documentation of income, a few pay stubs, and the contact information for the hardware store's owner. The conversation lasted only 15 minutes, but it felt like an immense test. At one point, the landlord studied him in silence, eyebrows slightly raised, as if weighing the authenticity in his words. Michael's heart thudded, uncertain how she might interpret his story. Yet she maintained a respectful air, pausing occasionally to confirm a detail, never once dismissing him outright. By the end, she stood, offered a handshake, and stated that while she had other applicants, she would keep his file on her desk for serious consideration. In that moment, Michael sensed a delicate shift, from feeling like an imposter who might be exposed at any second to someone tentatively standing on his own 2 feet. Outside the cafe, Keanu quietly offered a nod of encouragement but refrained from intruding. He understood the significance of letting Michael find his own footing without overshadowing him. In the days that followed, Michael returned to work, splitting his mental energy between assisting customers and worrying about the possible acceptance or rejection from the landlord. Each day at the hardware store reminded him of his current security. Rows of tools, nails, and paint cans offered a kind of structured comfort, items neatly in their places, tasks neatly assigned. His boss, Joe, rarely indulged in small talk, but on occasion, he dropped hints that Michael might want to keep an eye open for new shipments or upcoming promotions. It was as close to an endorsement as Joe would ever give. Then, one evening, after Michael had returned to his motel room, he received an unexpected phone call. On the line was the landlord's assistant, informing him that, should he still be interested, he had been accepted for the studio apartment. The news wove a surging thread of shock and excitement through his body, as if he had been handed a key not just to a room, but also to a rebuilt sense of identity. He managed to stammer out his gratitude, and as he hung up, an extraordinary hush filled the small motel room. Keanu arrived not long after, as if he had an intuitive sense of when big moments occurred, and found Michael practically packing in circles, formulating next steps about deposits, utility setup, and the logistical puzzle of physically moving his few belongings. Though Michael had little more than a suitcase of clothes and a handful of items, the emotional weight of acquiring a new place felt colossal. Keanu, witnessing both the excitement and the anxiety in Michael's eyes, reminded him that the best approach was to handle each new obligation one at a time. They arranged a date for the move-in, which fell on a bright Saturday morning. The day dawned with a light breeze that hinted at summer's approach, bringing mild sunshine that glinted off skyscraper windows. Keanu arrived on his motorcycle, having convinced a friend with a small truck to meet them at the motel. Michael needed scarcely an hour to gather his life's possessions, an arrangement that felt humbling but also liberating, as there were no cumbersome objects tethering him to the past. Arriving at the low-rise apartment building, they were greeted by the landlord's assistant holding a ring of keys. She offered them with a polite smile, then stepped back, gesturing for Michael to head up the short flight of stairs on his own. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint and cleaning detergent. Evidently, someone had tidied up in anticipation of his arrival. When he reached the door labeled 2C, he slipped the key into the lock and felt the curious, empowering click as he turned it. Inside was a single room, walls painted a neutral cream, a pair of windows that overlooked a narrow street, and a compact kitchenette tucked into one corner. It was unassuming, perhaps even a bit cramped, but to Michael it felt like an unclaimed universe. Here, he could decide how to arrange his small bed, whether to place a rug near the window, or if he wanted to adorn the plain walls with personal mementos. It felt like a moment outside of time, as if the city's thousands of sirens and horns fell away to let him absorb the magnitude of this new beginning. Keanu quietly observed from the threshold. Though he remained in the background, his presence offered an unspoken thread of encouragement. That day, he helped carry in the one duffel bag Michael owned, along with a few cheap supplies for basic living, a thrift store lamp, some kitchen utensils, a single folding chair. Keanu never acted paternal or controlling. He simply respected the transition. Standing side by side in the empty studio, both men recognized something sacred. A place that, for all its simplicity, symbolized personal agency, dignity, and a future no longer defined by desperation. Over the next few weeks, Michael focused on making that studio into a true home. Most of his wages from the hardware store went toward paying rent, plus a security deposit he had saved up with methodical discipline. He learned firsthand how water, electricity, and internet bills could easily swallow a meager paycheck, a lesson that forced him to refine his budgeting skills on the fly. Yet each new challenge, from installing a second-hand air conditioner to stocking a mini fridge, was a test of resilience he now felt equipped to pass. Keanu continued to check in, but never in a way that suggested pity or paternal oversight. Instead, he and Michael often spoke about how, once one found stability, the greater obligation was to pass that kindness forward. Keanu believed that a compassionate gesture, like helping one struggling stranger in the street, could ripple through an entire community if nurtured correctly. As if to illustrate his point, Keanu occasionally invited Michael to quiet charitable events, small gatherings that did not clamor for paparazzi attention, but involved direct support to people in need. Michael felt both gratitude and humility at being introduced to these circles, which ranged from soup kitchens to reading programs in underserved neighborhoods. Yet, amid this renewed sense of purpose, Michael faced the inevitable shadows of fear. Waking up some mornings, he questioned whether the delicate structure he was building might collapse with a single twist of fate, an unexpected health expense, a sudden job loss, or a random turn of bad luck. When these anxieties pressed close, he sometimes remembered how it felt to sleep next to dumpsters, making a pillow out of old newspapers. He might then pause in the middle of unpacking a grocery bag or wiping down his tiny counter, reminding himself how far he had come. During those reflective moments, he realized that the life he was forging did not revolve around an illusion of perfect security. Instead, it thrived on the decision to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. Gradually, the familiar pangs of self-doubt softened. Each time he made the choice to trust in this slow but steady ascent, it became a little easier to believe that his efforts could be lasting. Throughout this phase, Keanu Reeves remained a beacon, not in the sense of overshadowing Michael's accomplishments, but rather by offering him the subtle assurance that goodness did exist and could be pursued with integrity. Keanu's schedule often whisked him off to film locations in distant cities or on global press tour. Yet even across time zones, he would stay in touch, occasionally sending Michael brief notes of encouragement or inquiring if there was anything he might need. During one of these intervals when Keanu was out of town, Michael took on the challenge of training a new coworker at the hardware store. The new hire had trouble following the daily routines. Confusion about product codes and panicked rummaging through stock boxes became regular sights. Michael recognized a glimmer of his own earlier trepidation in this coworker. Rather than mock or dismiss the newcomer's struggles, he calmly guided them, explained tasks step by step, and stayed late when needed to help reorganize disordered shelves. In those after hours, when the lights were half-dimmed and the store felt nearly peaceful, Michael could almost see the reflection of his younger self in the metal spines of the tools. He recalled how Joe had once towered over him with a gruff stare, waiting to see if Michael would deliver on his promises. Now, Michael was the one offering that crucial first sense of acceptance. It made him appreciate the cyclical nature of support, how one person's shift from despair to stability could ripple outward to assist others on their own precarious journeys. By the time Keanu returned to the city, he found Michael in a far different state than the man he had once found shivering under flickering streetlights. Michael stood taller, wore cleaner clothes, and possessed a kind of measured calm in his gaze. The hardware store was thriving with extra customers preparing for renovations or small home improvement projects, and Joe seemed to rely on Michael for day-to-day operations in a way that hinted at deeper trust. One evening, after closing the store, Michael joined Keanu for a simple meal in a tucked-away restaurant near the East Village. While there was no fanfare, no special reservations, it felt fitting, a shared moment between two individuals who had impacted each other in ways both subtle and profound. Inside the warmly lit space, overhead lamps cast a cozy glow on worn tables and chairs, the hum of other patrons providing a relaxed soundtrack of muffled conversation and the clink of dishes. Keanu asked how the new living situation was working out, and Michael, with a sense of genuine pride, recounted the small victories, cooking his own meals, paying bills on time, learning the quirks of an outdated heating system in his building. He admitted that some nights, he still felt the remnants of stress coil in his stomach, worrying about how quickly a fragile life could unravel. Yet each time such thoughts arose, he found renewed courage in the progress already made. It was at this moment that Michael realized Keanu Reeves was not simply a generous patron. He was a silent partner in this grand project of helping people restore their lives. The actor might have had multiple commitments, philanthropic or personal, but each was anchored in the conviction that no act of compassion was wasted. They continued talking into the evening, not in loud, jubilant bursts, but in thoughtful reflections over life's twists and turns. When the meal ended, both parted ways outside, each stepping into the same crisp city air they had once walked beneath in entirely different circumstances. In the subsequent weeks, Michael found a quiet momentum settling into his daily life. He opened a small bank account, carefully monitored receipts, and occasionally used the library's free resources to educate himself about personal finance, something that had once seemed too daunting to contemplate. The city itself took on new shapes in his perspective. Where once he had only seen looming shadows and towering obstacles, he now noticed the small signs of progress blossoming in unanticipated places, like vacant lots repurposed into community gardens or local art projects, brightening previously neglected corners. Eventually, spring matured into a pleasant summer, the air turning warm and inviting. By then, Michael had saved enough to purchase a few necessities: a small dresser, a used bookshelf to store his growing collection of second-hand paperbacks, and a basic coffee maker. Each item seemed to carry a symbolic weight, an external marker of an internal transformation. One day, he decided to pay a quiet visit to the neighborhood he used to roam when he was homeless, a route he had rarely taken since his life changed. The old corners and side streets, once so dominated by his aimless trudging, appeared both strange and familiar. The city's usual swirl of commerce and commotion had not ceased. Taxis honked, tourists snapped photographs, and countless individuals hurried to keep appointments only they deemed urgent. Yet Michael's vantage point had changed irrevocably. Where he once sat against a wall wrapped in a threadbare coat, he now stood upright with a small duffel bag, carrying fresh clothing he intended to donate to a nearby shelter. The building was an unassuming structure marred by peeling paint, but inside he found volunteers systematically sorting everything from canned goods to blankets. After a brief conversation, the coordinator recognized Michael from a time he had dropped in for hot meals on the roughest nights. The coordinator's expression flickered between surprise and genuine happiness, letting Michael know that transformation, no matter how rare, was always a reason to celebrate. After leaving the donated items, Michael strolled back through the streets that had once swallowed him into anonymity. He paused at the threshold of the alleyway where he and Keanu had first crossed paths. The place looked as worn and unkempt as ever, the same flickering street lamp casting a feeble glow across scattered debris. He took in a slow breath, letting the magnitude of that memory settle over him. In that single moment, a cosmic shift had occurred. The mercy extended by a kind stranger on a bitterly cold evening had cracked open the claustrophobic space that had nearly trapped him forever. Later, he returned to his studio, the small space that had become a refuge of stability. He sat on the edge of his bed, letting the steady hum of city life outside the window blend with his thoughts. Flickers of memory rose in waves. The cardboard that once served as his mattress, the subtle ache of hunger that never fully left him back then, and the fierce wind that chilled him through to his core. Yet these images appeared like ghosts, overshadowed by the tangible reality of a new life that, while far from lavish, contained genuine hope and self-direction. He spent that evening drafting a letter, an idea he had toyed with for a while. In it, he expressed gratitude to Keanu Reeves, not just for the concrete help of food, shelter, or employment leads, but for the unwavering conviction that a life could be rebuilt. He wrote about how the compassion Keanu had shown was not just a lucky break, but a profound statement of faith in human potential. As he finished, he felt an odd mixture of vulnerability and relief. It was one thing to be grateful. It was another thing to put that gratitude into words, to face one's past squarely and recognize the roles played by others in fueling the journey forward. Over time, Michael decided to replicate Keanu's example in small increments. He befriended an elderly neighbor in his building, helping her carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs. He stopped by a local youth center on weekends, occasionally pitching in by organizing supplies or offering to mentor a teenager who was struggling to stay motivated. These gestures were not grand or newsworthy, but that was precisely the point. They formed the heartbeat of a quiet revolution of kindness, an undercurrent that might not appear in headlines, yet possessed the power to transform individual lives. As for Keanu, his own commitments ebbed and flowed. He filmed in distant cities, showed up at red carpet premieres, and engaged in projects that demanded he slip seamlessly into different roles. Whenever he was back in New York, the two would reconnect, sometimes sharing a meal, sometimes simply walking through a public park in companionable silence. Their bond had transcended the initial dynamic of rescuer and rescued. They were now two individuals who understood life's fragility and the importance of not letting that fragility discourage a willingness to care. Eventually, on a softly lit evening when the city was alive with the hum of summer festivities, a kind of informal reunion occurred in the hardware store. Joe, who had never been one for celebration, had nonetheless agreed to close the store a bit early. A few coworkers lingered behind, including the new hire Michael had trained, and they shared a simple potluck meal among shelves stocked with nails and screws. Somebody streamed quiet music from a phone, and cardboard boxes were rearranged to form makeshift seating. Keanu, in a moment of calm between filming schedules, arrived halfway through, offering a wry smile at the sight of plastic cups lined up against the register. He greeted everyone with the casual ease of a man who had learned that true connection rarely required formalities. The gathering was a quiet acknowledgement of how much had changed in a matter of months, for Michael, for the store, and in some small sense, for each person who had witnessed the unfolding story. In a warm hush, Michael reflected on how the store's fluorescent lights bounced off the metal surfaces of the tools, bathing the group in a softly surreal glow. He recognized that while these aisles had once felt foreign, they now carried the unmistakable stamp of a place he belonged. The city still housed countless hardships, and he understood that not everyone would receive the same good fortune he had. Yet he also believed that each selfless act, however small, could tip the balance just enough to give someone a fighting chance. That evening's conversation meandered from jokes about customers who demanded impossible returns to recollections of how Michael had struggled to differentiate between certain tool brands in his early weeks. Joe, stoic as ever, rarely spoke, but his presence at this makeshift get-together signaled acceptance in its own way, as if the crust of his outer shell had finally thinned. The new coworker, once rattled by confusion, now laughed easily alongside the rest, having found a mentor in Michael that mirrored the support Michael himself had received. Meanwhile, Keanu was uncharacteristically still in the background. Though the music was subdued and the conversation mostly light, it was clear he watched each moment with quiet appreciation. Nobody rushed for photos or posted the event to social media, which was precisely how he preferred these intimate gatherings. This was about people, not performance. And in that ephemeral harmony, Michael realized that the kindness he had been gifted was not just about escaping homelessness. It had been an invitation to believe in the better angels of human nature, to embrace the bonds that formed out of mutual respect and shared vulnerability. When the gathering wound down and the last bit of leftover food was packed up, Michael found himself alone with Keanu near the store entrance, where metal gates cast geometric shadows on the floor. He felt an unspoken push to express, one more time, the immensity of what Keanu's unwavering kindness had meant. Yet as he opened his mouth to speak, he sensed that no formal statement was necessary. Their shared gaze was enough, a gentle acknowledgement that their connection was built on experiences that surpassed words. Stepping outside, they were greeted by a rich summer night. The air no longer held the foreboding chill of winter. Instead, it felt lush, vibrant, filled with the hum of distant traffic and the faint laughter of people enjoying open-air cafes. From the vantage point of the hardware store stoop, the city's lights stretched out, a chaotic tapestry of brilliance that had once overwhelmed Michael but now felt like home. Keanu, after a few beats of contemplative silence, lightly tapped Michael on the shoulder in a gesture reminiscent of how they had parted ways several times before. Then, with a soft smile, he slipped into the flow of pedestrians. Eventually, his silhouette merged with the broader crowd, leaving Michael at the threshold of a place that had transformed his life. In that moment, Michael caught sight of his reflection in the store's glass door. He saw someone changed, not merely by the shield of a stable address and a reliable paycheck, but by the intangible armor of self-belief. He recognized in the faint lines of his face both what he had endured and what he had gained, a past heavy with misfortune and a present illuminated by the quiet miracle of kindness. Within his reflection, he saw a testament to the truth that redemption rarely arrives in sudden, sweeping gestures. It is stitched together day by day in the small pockets of grace one either shares or receives. Keanu's role had been to open that first pocket of grace, but the reason it endured was because Michael had fought to keep building on it. In that understanding, Michael found a sense of closure he never knew he needed. As he turned to lock up, he passed one final glance over the darkened store. Tomorrow, it would be filled with daylight again, welcoming curious customers, whirring fans, and new arrivals of stock. Joe would bark instructions, coworkers would crack jokes about miscounted inventory, and Michael would assume his daily tasks with confidence. Outside, the city's ceaseless metamorphosis would continue. But somewhere in the swirl of subways, gridlocked streets, and flickering neon signs, the threads of this story, an encounter between a once invisible man and a world-famous actor, would continue to weave their way into unknown destinies. Leaving the hardware store behind, Michael stepped onto the sidewalk under streetlights that glowed softly. In the distance, he thought he could still sense Keanu's presence, as though the man's spirit lingered wherever an open heart found reason to believe. Michael smiled quietly, nodding to himself in a subtle vow to live up to the faith that had been placed in him. In the end, this was not merely about a single act of generosity. It was a testament to what could unfold when empathy met perseverance, how two lives, colliding in a chance encounter, could radiate a transformative ripple that went far beyond the alley where it all began. On that warm summer night, Michael finally felt the weight of what it meant to seize hope and carry it forward, a bright spark in a city of endless flickering lights. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.